Hello there. Welcome to Ancient Earth Documentary Podcast. In this episode, we focus on how prehistoric ocean animals communicated. 400 million years beneath the waves, something impossible was happening. Ancient seas were alive with conversations we're only now beginning to decode. Animals that look alien to us were solving the same problem every social creature faces. How do you talk when there's no such thing as talking? The ocean isn't silent. It never was. But the ways prehistoric creatures communicated challenge everything we assume about language, signals, and connection. Some used light in pitch darkness. Others weaponized electricity. A few developed sensory organs so sophisticated that modern technology can barely replicate them. And all of this happened long before the first animal ever crawled onto land. Wow. What you're about to discover isn't just ancient history. It's the origin story of communication itself. Water changes everything. If you've ever tried yelling to someone underwater, you know sound behaves differently there. What you might not know is just how differently. In air, your voice travels at roughly 767 miles per hour. Decent speed. In water, that same sound rockets along at over 3,000 miles per hour, 5 times faster. The ocean isn't just a medium for sound. It's an amplifier, a conductor, a communication superhighway that's existed since the first seas formed. This matters because 407 million years ago, when most complex life still lived underwater, something revolutionary happened. According to fossil evidence and comparative anatomy studies, acoustic communication descended from a single ancestor. One creature figured out how to make intentional sounds, and that innovation spread through the evolutionary tree like wildfire through dry grass. Every vertebrate that uses sound today, from whales to wolves to you, inherited that ability from an ancient fish that discovered its body could create meaningful vibrations. But here's where it gets strange. That first sound maker wasn't trying to invent language. It was probably trying to attract a mate or warn off a rival. The fact that its descendants would eventually write symphonies and argue about politics would have seemed as impossible as fish developing legs and walking on land. Which of course they eventually did. The physics of underwater sound transmission gave those early communicators advantages that land animals would never fully replicate. Sound doesn't just travel faster in water, it travels farther, bends around objects more effectively, and can be channeled through temperature layers in ways that seem almost magical. There's a phenomenon called the SOFAR channel, the sound fixing and ranging channel, that exists at a specific depth where temperature changes create a natural acoustic highway. Sounds trapped in this channel can travel thousands of miles with minimal energy loss. Modern whales might use this channel to communicate across entire ocean basins. Their prehistoric ancestors might have stumbled onto the same trick tens of millions of years ago. Imagine being able to send a message that travels from California to Japan without technology, just by understanding which depth to broadcast from. The ancient ocean wasn't empty space. It was an information network. Around 400 million years ago, crustaceans started making clicking sounds. Why? Because clicking worked. It attracted mates, startled predators, and established territory. Early fishes, always looking for their next meal, developed the ability to hear those clicks. An evolutionary arms race began. If you could hear clicks, you gained an advantage. If you could make clicks, you gained a different advantage. If you could do both and interpret what different patterns meant, you became formidable. This is the fundamental engine of communication evolution. One organism's signal becomes another organism's opportunity. The fish that could hear crustacean clicks knew where food was hiding. The crustacean that could vary its clicks might confuse predators or coordinate with others of its kind. Complexity built on complexity, layer by layer, until the ocean became a cacophony of meaningful noise. But sound wasn't the first language of the sea. Before anything made intentional noises, ancient creatures were already talking with light. Bioluminescence, the ability to produce light through chemical reactions, evolved much earlier than scientists originally thought. New evidence suggests it emerged around the time of the Cambrian explosion. That dramatic period, 540 million years ago, when life on Earth suddenly diversified into a bewildering array of forms. This timing isn't coincidental. The Cambrian was an era of new predators, new prey, new competitive pressures. Animals needed every advantage they could get. Light became one of those advantages. In the deep ocean, where sunlight never penetrates, bioluminescence was the earliest form of communication. It still is. Animals that live in perpetual darkness can't use color patterns or body language in the way surface creatures do, but they can flash, glow, pulse, and create patterns of light that means something to others watching. Think of it as Morse code written in living chemistry. Light signaling gave animals a new way to communicate in a rapidly changing world. When the Cambrian seas filled with predators that had never existed before, prey species needed warning systems. A creature that could flash a danger signal saved not just itself, but its neighbors. A predator that could mimic those signals gained an unfair advantage. The sophistication escalated quickly. Modern cephalopods, descendants of ancient mollusks, demonstrate just how far this system evolved. Squid and octopuses can change their color and pattern in fractions of a second using specialized cells called chromatophores. But they don't just use this for camouflage. They use it to communicate emotional states, intentions, threats, and courtship signals. Their skin is effectively a high-definition biological display screen. Some can even produce polarized light patterns that other species can't see, creating a private communication channel hidden in plain sight. Their ancient ancestors probably had simpler versions of these abilities, but the principle was the same. Light was language, patterns were grammar, and in the deep ocean, being fluent in light meant the difference between eating and being eaten. The creatures who mastered these early communication systems didn't look like anything you'd recognize today. Take trilobites, for instance. These armored arthropods dominated Paleozoic seas for 270 million years, longer than dinosaurs ruled the land. You've probably seen their fossils, those segmented oval creatures that look like a cross between a pill bug and an alien spacecraft. What the fossils don't show you is just how sophisticated their sensory systems were. Trilobite eyes were technological marvels. Some species had holochroal eyes containing over 15,000 individual lenses, each one made of calcite crystal, the same mineral that forms limestone and marble. These weren't simple light sensors. They were compound eyes that could detect movement, estimate distance, and probably see fairly well in low light. Scientists have used CT scanning and synchrotron radiation to study 400-million-year-old trilobite eyes, and the structure they found was remarkably similar to the compound eyes of modern horseshoe crabs. The system worked so well that evolution has preserved the basic design across hundreds of millions of years. But trilobites weren't just watching the world, they were feeling it in ways we can barely imagine. Their exoskeletons were covered in specialized structures, pits, canals, tubercles, and spines that served as sensory organs. Some researchers believe these spines were flexible and nerve-filled, functioning as a kind of full-body antenna system. A trilobite could feel disturbances in the water around it, detecting the movement of predators, prey, or potential mates from a distance. The cephalon, the head section of a trilobite, housed not just eyes but also antennae used for chemical and tactile sensing, plus the mouth and its feeding appendages. Everything about trilobite anatomy suggests they lived in a rich sensory world, gathering information through multiple channels simultaneously. They were processing visual data, chemical signals, and mechanical vibrations all at once, integrating it into a coherent picture of their environment. This is important because it reveals something crucial about ancient ocean communication. It was never just one thing. Animals didn't rely solely on sound or light or chemical signals. They used everything available. The ocean provided multiple channels, and evolutionary success meant learning to broadcast and receive on all of them. Which brings us to one of the strangest and most alien sensory systems ever to evolve: electroreception. Sharks can sense electricity. You probably knew that. What you might not realize is how ancient and how sensitive this ability is. The ampullae of Lorenzini, the specialized organ sharks use to detect electric fields, evolved from the mechanosensory lateral line system in early vertebrates over 400 million years ago. This means electroreception is an ancestral trait, something that appeared early in vertebrate evolution and has been preserved because it works so extraordinarily well. How well? Sharks can detect electric fields as weak as 5 nanovolts per centimetre. That's roughly the electrical field produced by a AA battery, connected to electrodes 1,000 miles apart. It's a level of sensitivity that seems almost supernatural. Every living creature produces bioelectric fields through the normal function of their nerves and muscles. To a shark, these fields are visible signatures, electromagnetic silhouettes that can't be hidden by camouflage or darkness or murky water. Ancient sharks weren't just using this to hunt, though hunting was certainly part of it. Electroreception likely played a role in communication and navigation as well. Some researchers believe sharks might use the Earth's magnetic field for long-distance navigation, detecting tiny variations in electromagnetic gradients to create mental maps of their territories. Others suggest that electrical signals might have served as a private communication channel between individuals, detectable only at close range but impossible to intercept from a distance. The really fascinating part is that electroreception isn't unique to sharks. Bony fishes like coelacanths and sturgeons also have ampullae of Lorenzini, indicating that the common ancestor of all these species possessed the ability. It's an ancient sense that most vertebrates eventually lost as they adapted to different environments, but in the ocean, it remained valuable enough to keep. This is a pattern we'll see repeatedly in prehistoric ocean communication. The creatures that thrived weren't necessarily the ones with the strongest single sense. They were the ones with the most versatile sensory toolkit, the ability to switch between different communication modes depending on circumstances. Another crucial system that ancient fish relied on was the lateral line, a mechanosensory organ that detects movement and pressure, changes in the surrounding water. If you've ever looked closely at a fish, you might have noticed a faint line running along each side of its body. That's the lateral line, and it's far more sophisticated than it looks. The lateral line system allows fish to detect vibrations, track water currents, and sense the movements of other animals nearby. It's essentially a sense of distant touch, a way of feeling objects without making contact. For schooling fish, the lateral line is critical. Experiments with fish that had their vision blocked showed they could still integrate into schools perfectly well as long as their lateral lines were functional. But fish with severed lateral lines, even ones that could see, couldn't maintain proper spacing or coordination with their schoolmates. This tells us something important about how prehistoric fish schools operated. Those massive formations of fish moving in perfect synchronization, turning as one unit without any apparent leader, weren't following visual cues primarily. They were feeling each other through water pressure and vibration, creating a kind of collective sensory awareness. Each fish was simultaneously broadcasting its movements and detecting the movements of others, creating a feedback loop that allowed the entire group to function almost like a single organism. The lateral line is ancient, found in fish species that diverged over 400 million years ago. It's one of those evolutionary innovations so useful that once it appeared, it became nearly universal among aquatic vertebrates. Even some amphibians retain lateral line organs, at least in their aquatic life stages. Predatory fish use the lateral line to detect the vibrations made by their prey, orienting toward the source and initiating their attack. Prey fish use it to detect the approach of predators, often reacting to pressure waves before the predator is visually detectable. It's an ongoing sensory arms race, with both sides constantly refining their ability to generate, detect, and interpret waterborne vibrations. But perhaps the most ancient and universal communication method in the prehistoric ocean wasn't mechanical or electrical or even visual. It was chemical. Chemical signals are nature's oldest form of communication, and in the ocean they're extraordinarily effective. Unlike sound, which fades quickly, or light, which gets absorbed by water, chemical signals can persist for extended periods. They travel on ocean currents, spreading information across vast distances. A single molecule released by one animal can be detected by another miles away, hours or even days later. Aquatic organisms use chemical compounds to convey information about food sources, potential mates, danger, and even their reproductive status. Using pheromones, fish can inform each other about immediate threats, signal their readiness to spawn, identify which species they belong to, and maintain communication within schools or between parents and offspring. It's a molecular language that predates almost every other form of communication we've discussed. Think about the scope of what this means. A female fish ready to breed releases specific chemical compounds into the water. These molecules disperse through currents, creating an invisible trail that males of her species can detect and follow. The concentration gradient tells them which direction to swim. The specific molecular structure tells them exactly what species she is, whether she's receptive, and sometimes even her general health and genetic quality. All of this information encoded in molecules too small to see. What's remarkable is the longevity of these signals. Sound fades within seconds or minutes. Visual displays require line of sight and decent visibility. But chemical messages can persist for hours, sometimes days. Ocean currents carry them for miles, creating communication networks that span distances no individual animal could traverse. A predator that passed through an area hours ago might have left chemical traces that still warn prey to stay away. A school of fish might leave a chemical wake that helps stragglers find and rejoin the group long after the school itself has moved on. This persistence creates something unusual in the communication world: asynchronous messaging. Most animal communication happens in real time. You make a sound, another animal hears it immediately. You display a color pattern, another animal sees it right then. But chemical communication allows for delayed reception. The sender and receiver don't need to be in the same place at the same time. It's more like leaving a note than having a conversation. Of course, this persistence comes with complications. Chemical signals can't be turned off once released. They linger whether you want them to or not. A wounded fish might leave a blood trail that attracts every predator in the area for hours, even after the wound has healed. An animal trying to hide can still be broadcasting its presence chemically long after it's found cover. There's no delete button in chemical communication. The sophistication of chemical detection in ancient fish was extraordinary. Specialized receptor cells in the nasal cavities and sometimes on the skin could detect concentrations so low we'd need laboratory equipment to measure them. Some species could distinguish between dozens of different chemical compounds, each conveying different information. Others could detect changes in concentration that would tell them not just that a signal was present, but how far away and in which direction the source was located. We know chemical communication was widespread in prehistoric oceans because the anatomical structures for detecting these signals appear very early in the fossil record. Olfactory organs, specialized receptor cells, even the neural pathways for processing chemical information, all of these show up in ancient fish that lived hundreds of millions of years ago. The specifics varied, but the basic system was nearly universal. Now, here's where things get interesting. During the Devonian period, roughly 400 to 360 million years ago, something remarkable happened in the oceans. This era is often called the Age of Fishes, and for good reason. Jawed fish diversified explosively, developing into an astounding array of forms and sizes. And with this physical diversification came an equally impressive expansion in communication strategies. We have fossil evidence from this period that suggests fish were engaging in complex courtship behaviours. Large radial trace fossils from the Upper Devonian, circular patterns carved into the seafloor, may have been structures created by male fish to attract females. If this interpretation is correct, it represents the first reported example of courtship behaviour in fish fossils, meaning animal courtship has existed for at least 360 million years. Picture this ancient scene. A male fish, perhaps something resembling a modern lungfish or one of the early ray-finned varieties, carefully excavates a circular pattern in the sediment. The pattern is symmetrical, deliberate, possibly several feet in diameter. He's not building a nest in the traditional sense. He's creating a visual advertisement, a structure that says to passing females, "I'm here, I'm capable, I have the energy and skill to create this display. Choose me." This tells us something profound about Devonian fish. They weren't just reacting to their environment or operating on pure instinct. They were capable of complex, goal-oriented behaviour that required planning, effort, and an understanding that their actions could influence the behaviour of others. That's sophisticated communication by any measure. Other Devonian fish use body language extensively. Stethecanthus, an early shark with a distinctive anvil-shaped dorsal fin covered in tooth-like scales, may have used this bizarre structure for visual communication. The current theory suggests this fin was primarily a display organ, used either to intimidate rivals or to signal status to potential mates. Modern sharks use a range of bodily gestures, arching their backs, opening their jaws, changing their swimming patterns to communicate threat, submission, or interest. Stethecanthus was likely doing something similar, using its unusual anatomy to broadcast messages that other members of its species could immediately understand. What's particularly fascinating about the Devonian explosion in communication is that it coincides with increasing predation pressure and environmental complexity. As ecosystems became more crowded and competitive, the ability to communicate effectively became a survival advantage. Fish that could coordinate with their schoolmates, identify suitable mates, warn others of danger, or establish territories without constant physical conflict. These fish had better survival and reproductive success. Communication wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity driven by ecological pressure. The evolution of communication also reveals something about cognitive capacity. To communicate effectively, you need more than just the ability to produce and detect signals. You need the neural hardware to interpret what those signals mean and to adjust your behavior accordingly. A fish that sees another fish perform a specific swimming pattern needs to recognize that pattern, associate it with a particular meaning, and then decide how to respond. That requires memory, pattern recognition, and decision-making ability. Fossil evidence of brain structure in ancient fish suggests that cognitive capacity was increasing alongside sensory sophistication. The regions of the brain dedicated to processing sensory information were expanding. Neural pathways were becoming more complex. We're not talking about fish philosophers contemplating the nature of existence, but we're talking about creatures with genuinely sophisticated information processing capabilities. Let's shift our focus now to a group of animals that dominated Paleozoic seas long before fish became the dominant vertebrates. Trilobites, those iconic arthropods with their segmented bodies and compound eyes, ruled the ocean floor for roughly 270 million years. They appeared during the Cambrian explosion and didn't go extinct until the end of the Permian. That's an extraordinarily successful run. Longer than dinosaurs, longer than mammals, longer than almost any other group of complex animals. And trilobites didn't just survive. They thrived. diversifying into thousands of species occupying nearly every marine environment, from tropical reefs to deep ocean basins. Part of their success was undoubtedly their sensory capabilities and their ability to communicate with each other and interpret their environment. Trilobite eyes were remarkable. The most common type, holocrol eyes, consisted of sometimes more than 15,000 individual lenses packed into compound eye structures. Using advanced scanning techniques, including synchrotron radiation analysis, scientists have examined the cellular structure of these 400-million-year-old eyes. What they found was sophisticated, organized sensory cells forming structures similar to the compound eyes of modern horseshoe crabs, which are actually distant relatives of trilobites. These weren't simple light detectors. Trilobite eyes could form images, detect movement, and likely perceive depth and distance. In clear ancient seas, this gave trilobites a significant advantage. They could spot predators approaching from above, identify potential mates, and navigate complex reef structures. Visual communication would have been entirely possible for these creatures. But vision wasn't their only sense. Trilobite exoskeletons were covered with various structures, pits, canals, tubercles, and spines that scientists believe served sensory functions. Some of these may have detected chemical signals in the water. Others might have been mechanoreceptors, sensitive to vibrations or water movement. The spines that many trilobite species sported weren't just defensive armor. Some researchers speculate they were flexible, nerve-filled sensory organs that increased a trilobite's ability to feel disturbances in the surrounding water, functioning much like the lateral line system that would later evolve in fish. The cephalon, the head section of a trilobite, typically house the compound eyes when present, a single pair of antennae for sensory perception, and the mouth with its associated feeding appendages. This concentration of sensory organs in the head region suggests trilobites were constantly sampling their environment, gathering information from multiple sources simultaneously. Did trilobites communicate with each other? We can't say for certain, but the evidence points toward yes. Animals with sophisticated sensory systems typically use them not just to perceive their environment, but to interact with others of their species. Trilobites likely used visual displays, possibly changing the angle of their bodies to catch light differently, or positioning themselves in specific ways that other trilobites would recognize. They may have released chemical signals, pheromones that conveyed information about reproductive status, territory, or danger. They might have used their appendages or spines to create vibrations that other trilobites could detect. The key insight here is that sensory sophistication and communication capability tend to evolve together. You don't develop complex eyes unless there's something worth seeing. You don't develop chemical detection unless there are meaningful chemical signals in your environment. And many of those meaningful signals come from other members of your own species, trying to tell you something. While trilobites ruled the Paleozoic seafloor with their compound eyes and sensory spines, another revolution was unfolding in the water column above them. Sound was entering the conversation. Around 400 million years ago, during a period scientists now call the Age of Fishes, acoustic communication began its long evolutionary journey. This wasn't a sudden invention. It was a gradual realization by ancient marine life that water itself was an extraordinary communication medium, far superior to air in almost every measurable way. Here's what makes underwater sound so powerful. In ocean water, sound travels at approximately 1,450 meters per second. Compare that to sound in air, which moves at just 334 meters per second. That's more than 4 times faster. Water's density, the very property that makes it harder to move through, becomes an advantage for sound transmission. As ocean depth increases, pressure compresses water further, making it even denser, and sound moves faster still. This created something remarkable for ancient marine animals, a communication system that could work across vast distances. The physics gets more interesting. Sound waves in water refract differently than in air, bending as they pass through layers of different temperatures and pressures. At a specific depth, where temperature changes create what scientists call the thermocline, sound waves get trapped in what's known as the SOFAR channel, sound fixing and ranging channel. In this acoustic highway, sound can travel for hundreds, even thousands of miles with minimal energy loss. Modern whales use this channel extensively. Their prehistoric ancestors likely discovered it millions of years ago. So, who were the first to figure this out? The earliest evidence points to crustaceans. Around 400 million years ago, ancient crustaceans began producing clicking sounds, mechanical noises created by specialized body parts snapping together or rubbing against each other. Why would they bother? Because early fish were listening. Those fish had developed the ability to hear, initially as a way to detect prey. If your dinner is clicking and scraping across the ocean floor, being able to hear those sounds gives you a serious advantage. But once hearing evolved, something inevitable happened. Animals began using sound, not just to avoid being heard, but to be heard intentionally. Research shows that all acoustic communication invertebrates descended from a single common ancestor approximately 407 million years ago. This was a pivotal moment. One ancestral species figured out that you could make sounds that conveyed information, and that innovation spread through the evolutionary tree, branching into thousands of different communication systems. The Devonian period, spanning from about 419 to 359 million years ago, witnessed an explosion of fish diversity. Jawed fish, armored placoderms, early sharks, and the ancestors of modern bony fish all competed for space in Devonian seas. With so many species packed into overlapping territories, communication became essential. You needed ways to identify your own species, to signal aggression or submission, to attract mates, and to coordinate group behaviors. Fossil evidence from the Upper Devonian has revealed something unexpected. Large radial trace fossils, circular patterns preserved in ancient sediment, appear to be structured nests or display grounds created by male fish to attract females. These are the first known examples of courtship behavior in fish, suggesting that elaborate mating displays, the kind that require communication between participants, have existed for at least 360 million years. Males were building, females were choosing, and some form of signal must have passed between them. Early sharks provide another window into ancient communication. Modern sharks use a range of body postures and movements to signal intent. Arched backs, lowered pectoral fins, and open-mouth threat displays all communicate specific messages to other sharks. Fossil evidence from prehistoric sharks, like Stethecanthus, suggests that body language was already well developed. Stethecanthus had a bizarre anvil-shaped dorsal fin covered in denticles, tooth-like scales. Scientists believe this structure was a visual display device used to communicate with rivals or potential mates. Its strangeness was the point. It needed to be noticed. But let's step back from vision and body language for a moment. Because while those communication methods were developing, another sensory system was quietly becoming one of the most sophisticated information-gathering tools in the ancient ocean. The lateral line system. This is a feature you won't find in any land animal. It's exclusive to aquatic life, and it gave prehistoric fish abilities that seem almost like a sixth sense. The lateral line system consists of a series of fluid-filled canals running along the sides of a fish's body, connected to the surface through tiny pores. Inside these canals are sensory cells called neuromasts, clusters of hair cells that detect movement and pressure changes in the surrounding water. When something moves nearby, it creates pressure waves that travel through the water and into these canals. The hair cells bend, sending signals to the fish's brain. The result is a detailed three-dimensional map of everything moving in the immediate environment. This system is ancient. It's found in fish that diverged over 400 million years ago, making it one of the earliest specialized sensory adaptations in vertebrate evolution. And it's not just for detecting prey or predators. The lateral line plays a crucial role in social coordination. Fish schools, those mesmerizing clouds of synchronized swimmers, rely heavily on lateral line information. Each fish constantly monitors the movements of its neighbors, adjusting its own speed and direction to maintain formation. Experiments have shown that blinded fish can still swim in formation with their school, but fish with severed lateral lines cannot. They lose the ability to sense the collective, and they drift away, isolated. What does this mean for communication? It means that fish could send and receive signals through water movement alone. A flick of the tail, a sudden acceleration, even hovering in place creates distinctive pressure signatures. Other fish with functioning lateral lines would detect these patterns instantly. You could signal alarm by darting away suddenly. You could signal aggression by charging forward. You could signal courtship with specific swimming patterns, rhythmic movements that other fish would recognize as intentional communication rather than random motion. Now, add sound to this system. Because the lateral line doesn't just detect pressure waves from movement, it also picks up low-frequency sounds, vibrations that travel through water as pressure changes. This means fish weren't just hearing with their ears or whatever proto-ear structures they possessed. They were hearing with their entire lateral line system, feeling sounds as tactile sensations rippling along their bodies. Some prehistoric fish took this even further. In certain species, portions of the lateral line system became modified into specialized electroreceptors, structures capable of detecting electrical fields. These are called the ampullae of Lorenzini, and they represent one of the most extraordinary sensory adaptations in vertebrate history. Electroreception is an ancestral trait in vertebrates, meaning it evolved very early and was present in some of the earliest fish. Today, sharks are the undisputed masters of electroreception, able to detect electrical fields as weak as 5 nanovolts per centimeter. That's sensitive enough to sense the bioelectric field generated by a single heartbeat from several feet away. But electroreception wasn't just for hunting. It had communication potential. Every living organism generates electrical signals. Muscle contractions, nerve impulses, even the basic metabolic processes of cells produce measurable electrical activity. Fish with electroreceptors could potentially detect these signals from other fish. Could they distinguish between species, between individuals? Could they sense emotional states, the elevated electrical activity of a stressed or aggressive fish versus a calm one? We don't know for certain, but the capability was there. Some modern fish, particularly electric eels and certain catfish, actively generate electrical pulses as communication signals. Their ancestors may have been experimenting with this system hundreds of millions of years ago. Chemical communication was also reaching new levels of sophistication during this period. Chemical signals are arguably nature's most ancient form of communication, predating vision, hearing, and every other sense. Single-celled organisms respond to chemical gradients. Every living thing releases molecules into its environment, and every living thing can potentially detect those molecules. In water, chemical communication has unique advantages. Molecules dissolve and disperse, creating plumes that persist long after the animal that released them has moved on. Ocean currents carry these chemical messages across vast distances. For prehistoric fish, pheromones became essential tools. Chemical signals could convey information about species identity, making it easy to recognize your own kind even in murky water or at night. They could signal reproductive status, advertising when an individual was ready to mate. They could communicate danger, releasing alarm pheromones when a predator attacked, warning nearby fish to flee. They could mark territory, leaving chemical signatures that told intruders this area was claimed. Parent fish could chemically mark their offspring, and offspring could follow the chemical trail back to their parents. What's remarkable about chemical communication is its persistence. A visual signal disappears the moment you stop displaying it. A sound fades within seconds, but a chemical signal lingers. It tells a story of what happened here, minutes or even hours ago. For ancient fish navigating vast oceans, this created a kind of environmental memory. You could read the water itself, detecting traces of past events and using that information to make decisions. All these sensory systems, vision, sound detection, the lateral line, electroreception, and chemical sensing, weren't developing in isolation. They were evolving together, creating multimodal communication systems where different types of signals reinforced each other. An aggressive fish might simultaneously display visual threats, produce low-frequency sounds, create pressure waves with sudden movements, and release chemical signals associated with heightened aggression. The receiver would perceive this as an overwhelming, unified message. Back off. This multimodal approach had another advantage. Different environments favored different signal types. In clear, shallow water, visual signals worked perfectly. In murky river deltas or deep ocean zones where light didn't penetrate, chemical and acoustic signals became primary. By maintaining multiple communication channels, prehistoric fish ensured they could always get their message across, regardless of conditions. The Devonian seas were noisy, chemically complex, visually dynamic environments where countless species competed for resources and mates. Communication wasn't a luxury, it was survival. Every innovation in sensory capability opened new possibilities for social organization, for cooperation and competition, for the complex interactions that define animal societies. And these innovations were happening fast. The fossil record shows rapid diversification of sensory structures during this period. Evolution was experimenting, trying different approaches, seeing what worked. But there's something else happening here, something we need to consider. As these communication systems became more complex, they created selective pressure for bigger brains. Processing visual information requires neural tissue. Interpreting chemical signals requires neural tissue. Coordinating multiple sensory inputs simultaneously requires even more neural tissue. Fish brains began expanding, particularly in regions associated with sensory processing and integration. More sophisticated communication demanded more sophisticated cognition to understand it. This sets the stage for what comes next, because fish weren't going to remain the only players in the ocean communication game. New groups were about to enter the scene, bringing entirely different body plans, different sensory capabilities, different evolutionary pressures. The Mesozoic era brought something completely different. Around 250 million years ago, reptiles began their journey back into the oceans. These weren't fish. They were air-breathing vertebrates with fundamentally different body plans, different sensory priorities, different evolutionary baggage. And they brought entirely new approaches to underwater communication. Picture the early marine reptiles, ichthyosaurs, looking almost dolphin-like despite evolving that body shape completely independently. Plesiosaurs with their impossibly long necks. Mosasaurs, the ocean's apex predators, during the late Cretaceous. These animals faced a unique challenge. Their ancestors had spent millions of years adapting to life on land, developing ears designed for airborne sound, eyes optimized for terrestrial vision, communication systems that worked in open air. Now they had to make all of that function underwater again. The sensory trade-offs were fascinating. Reptilian eyes work differently from fish eyes. Most marine reptiles probably saw well both above and below the water surface, an advantage when you need to breathe air but hunt underwater. Visual communication remained important for these creatures. Body postures, color patterns, physical displays, all the visual vocabulary that land reptiles had developed could still function in clear, shallow waters where many marine reptiles hunted. But sound presented problems. Reptilian ears evolved for detecting airborne vibrations, don't work particularly well underwater without modification. Yet we know from modern sea turtles that at least some ancient marine reptiles produce sounds. Sea turtles today vocalize during mating, producing roars and other calls when large individuals encounter each other. The mechanics involve gular pumping and vibration of tracheal membranes. It's not sophisticated, but it works. What's remarkable is that some marine reptiles went the opposite direction entirely. Recent fossil analysis of Temnodontosaurus, a massive ichthyosaur, revealed something unexpected. The shape of its flippers, particularly the serrated trailing edge and the lack of bones in the distal end, suggests this animal had evolved to move almost silently through the water. Rather than developing better communication, it was evolving stealth. When you're an ambush predator, hunting in murky Jurassic seas, staying quiet might matter more than talking. This raises a crucial point about communication evolution. It's not inevitable. It's not always advantageous. Sometimes, in certain ecological niches, silence is golden. The most successful predators often aren't the most communicative ones. They're the ghosts, the ones you don't hear coming. But while some marine reptiles were perfecting silence, others were developing social behaviors that required coordination. Fossil evidence suggests some plesiosaurs traveled in groups. Some mosasaurs showed evidence of cooperative hunting strategies. These behaviors demand communication. You can't coordinate group activities through silence alone. The challenge becomes figuring out how they did it. Fossils preserve bones beautifully, but soft tissues, the vocal cords, the sound-producing membranes, the chemical-sensing organs, these rarely fossilize. We're left inferring communication capabilities from anatomy and behavior, making educated guesses based on what modern relatives do and what physical structures would have made possible. Here's where the story gets particularly interesting. While marine reptiles were adapting to ocean life during the Mesozoic, something else was happening in deeper, darker waters. The realm of the cephalopods. Ammonites dominated Mesozoic oceans. These shelled cephalopods, relatives of modern squid and octopuses, came in sizes from tiny to absolutely massive. Some reached over 6 feet in diameter. They filled virtually every marine niche imaginable, from shallow reefs to open ocean to deep sea environments. And if their modern relatives are any indication, they were probably communicating in ways that would make fish look simple. Modern cephalopods possess communication abilities that border on alien. Squid and cuttlefish can change their skin patterns in fractions of a second, displaying colors, textures, and polarized light patterns that convey detailed information to others of their species. They communicate readiness to mate, aggressive intent, species identification, even emotional states. Their skin is essentially a high-resolution display screen, capable of showing moving patterns, waves of color, flashing signals. The key to this ability is chromatophores, specialized pigment cells controlled directly by the nervous system. Unlike most animals, where color changes involve hormones and take minutes or hours, cephalopods can reconfigure their appearance instantly because their brain is wired directly to their skin. It's voluntary, conscious, deliberate communication. Did ammonites have this capability? We can't know for certain. Chromatophores don't fossilize. But ammonites were cephalopods, and all modern cephalopods possess sophisticated visual communication systems. The evolutionary investment in these systems runs deep. It's not unreasonable to think ammonites had at least basic versions of these abilities. What we do know is that ammonites had eyes, good eyes, and eyes are expensive organs. You don't maintain complex visual systems unless you're using them. In species that rely heavily on visual communication, eye size and complexity often correlate with social behavior. Solitary species can get by with simpler eyes. Social species need to process complex visual information quickly. Some ammonite species show evidence of sexual dimorphism, males and females, with different shell shapes and sizes. This suggests mate selection, courtship behaviors, competition for mates. All of these activities typically involve communication. Males need to signal their fitness to females. Females need to signal receptivity. Rivals need to assess each other without necessarily fighting every time they meet. Cephalopods today also use ink for communication, not just defense. Ink clouds can serve as decoys, as smokescreens, but also as signals. A sudden ink release can communicate alarm to nearby individuals. The ink itself contains chemical compounds that might carry information. And yes, fossilized ink sacs have been found in some cephalopod fossils, including occasional preservation of the ink itself. These animals definitely had the equipment. But here's something that often gets overlooked in discussions of prehistoric ocean communication: bioluminescence. The ability to produce light. Bioluminescence evolved remarkably early. Current evidence suggests it appeared around 540 million years ago during the Cambrian explosion, when life was rapidly diversifying and predator-prey relationships were becoming more complex. Light signaling was possibly the earliest form of communication in the oceans, giving animals entirely new ways to interact in a rapidly changing world with new predators and more complex environments. For animals living in deep-sea environments where sunlight doesn't penetrate, bioluminescence becomes the primary visual communication method. And here's the thing: many ancient cephalopods lived in deeper waters. Many modern deep-sea squid use bioluminescence extensively, creating light shows that would rival any modern display technology. They use light to attract mates, to confuse predators, to lure prey, to signal to others of their species. Did ancient cephalopods do this? The chemical mechanisms for bioluminescence existed. The ecological pressures that make it advantageous existed. The darkness of deep oceans hasn't changed in hundreds of millions of years. It's entirely plausible that some ammonites and their relatives were producing light signals in Mesozoic seas, creating displays we can only imagine now. This brings us to a fundamental realization about prehistoric ocean communication. We tend to focus on what we can see in fossils, bones, and shells and preserved structures. But communication often happens through mechanisms that leave no fossil trace. Sounds, chemicals, light, electrical fields, these are ephemeral. They exist for a moment, and then they're gone, leaving no record in stone. So when we try to reconstruct how ancient ocean animals communicated, we're working with incomplete information. We know they had the sensory equipment. We know they lived in social groups or competed for mates, or coordinated hunting, or engaged in all the other behaviors that require communication. But the actual signals, the sounds and smells, and flashes of light, those are lost to time. What we can do is look at the trajectory. Communication systems were becoming more sophisticated throughout the Paleozoic and Mesozoic. Sensory organs were becoming more refined. Brains were getting larger. Social behaviors were becoming more complex. All of these trends point in the same direction, toward animals that were better at sending, receiving, and interpreting signals. And then, around 50 million years ago, something extraordinary happened. A group of land mammals, already adapted for terrestrial life, began returning to the oceans. These weren't reptiles this time. They were warm-blooded, highly intelligent, socially complex mammals. And they would develop the most sophisticated acoustic communication system ever to evolve in Earth's oceans. The early whales faced all the same challenges that marine reptiles had faced 200 million years earlier. Ears designed for air don't work well underwater. Communication systems developed for terrestrial environments need complete overhauls for marine life. But mammals had something reptiles didn't: more advanced brains, more complex social structures, and in the case of early whales, an evolutionary path that would lead to something unprecedented. The transition happened remarkably fast. Within 10 million years, whale ears had transformed from terrestrial organs to sophisticated underwater sound detectors. The key innovation was acoustic isolation. In terrestrial mammals, sound reaches the inner ear through the eardrum and a chain of tiny bones. It's a system that works beautifully in air, but terribly in water, where sound travels through bone and tissue almost as easily as through the ear canal, creating confusion about where sounds are coming from. Early whales solved this by gradually isolating their ear bones from the rest of the skull. In modern whales, the bones housing the middle and inner ears are completely separated, connected to the skull only by soft tissues. This isolation allows each ear to function independently, making directional hearing possible underwater. You can pinpoint where a sound is coming from with remarkable precision. But whales didn't just evolve better hearing. They evolved better sound production. And not just any sound production. Echolocation, biosonar, the ability to produce high-frequency clicks and interpret the returning echoes to create a detailed acoustic picture of their environment. Echolocation evolved around 39 million years ago in toothed whales, probably soon after they diverged from the ancestors of baleen whales. This wasn't gradual. Once the cochlea, the hearing organ, became specialized for sensing high-frequency sound, echolocation capabilities appeared quickly. Some archaic toothed whales possessed functional biosonar systems almost immediately after their origin. What's fascinating is that echolocation evolved twice independently in whale lineage. Once in an Oligocene stem odontocoete called Xenorophus, and once in crown Odontocetes, the group that includes all modern toothed whales. Evolution found this solution so advantageous that it invented it twice. The implications for communication are profound. Echolocation requires sophisticated sound production, precise frequency control, the ability to modulate clicks and interpret complex returning echoes. Once you have that level of acoustic control, using it for communication becomes almost trivial. You already have the equipment to make detailed, information-rich sounds. You already have the hearing sensitivity to detect subtle variations in those sounds. Communication becomes a natural extension of your sensory capabilities. Modern toothed whales use sound for everything. They echolocate to navigate and hunt. They produce whistles for social communication. They create pulsed calls for specific contexts. Some species have signature whistles, individually distinctive sounds that function almost like names. Dolphins can call to specific individuals using these signature whistles, and the called individual will respond. The acoustic environment of prehistoric oceans was fundamentally different once echolocating whales appeared. Suddenly there were animals producing intense, focused beams of sound, clicking constantly as they navigated and hunted. The ocean got much, much noisier and much more information-rich. These acoustic signals carried across vast distances, bouncing through the water column, creating a constant background of clicks and whistles and calls that other species could potentially eavesdrop on or learn from or respond to. But long before whales revolutionized underwater acoustics, other creatures had already mastered entirely different communication systems. Systems that didn't rely on sound at all. Go back far enough, before echolocation, before sophisticated hearing organs, before most animals even had ears, and you find communication methods so alien to our experience that we barely recognize them as communication. Chemical signals, molecular messages dissolved in seawater. This is where ocean communication actually begins, not with sound. With chemistry, chemical communication is ancient, staggeringly ancient. It predates eyes, ears, brains, even complex nervous systems. Single-celled organisms were already responding to chemical gradients billions of years ago, moving toward nutrients and away from toxins. When multicellular life appeared, these chemical sensing abilities didn't disappear. They evolved. They became more sophisticated, more specific, more information-rich. By the time we reached the Cambrian explosion, 540 million years ago, chemical communication had become extraordinarily refined. animals were releasing specific compounds to convey specific messages: danger, mating readiness, territorial boundaries, species identity. These weren't vague chemical clouds. They were precise molecular broadcasts carrying detailed information. The advantages of chemical communication in water are substantial. Unlike sound, which dissipates with distance, or light, which gets absorbed or scattered, chemical signals persist. A pheromone released into the current can travel for miles, maintaining its structure, carrying its message long after the sender has moved on. It's communication that outlasts the communicator. Water itself makes this possible. As a solvent, water is exceptional. It dissolves and carries an enormous variety of organic compounds. Temperature layers and currents create predictable transport routes. A chemical signal released at depth might ride a current for hours or days, broadcasting continuously to anyone with the right receptors. Ancient fish exploited this ruthlessly. Using pheromones, they could inform others of danger without making a sound that predators might hear. They could signal readiness to spawn without visual displays that would attract unwanted attention. They could mark territories that persisted even when they weren't present to defend them. Chemical communication was subtle, persistent, and remarkably difficult for predators to exploit. The specificity is what's truly impressive. A single chemical compound might mean nothing, but a combination of 3 compounds in a particular ratio. That's a message. That's information. Modern fish can distinguish between pheromones from different species, different sexes, even different individuals within their own species. There's no reason to think ancient fish were less capable. Fossils don't preserve pheromones, obviously, but they preserve the sensory structures that detected them. Ancient fish had olfactory organs, chemoreceptors, taste buds distributed across their bodies. The presence of these structures tells us chemical communication was happening. The sophistication of these structures suggests it was happening at a high level. Consider the implications for schooling behavior. Modern fish use chemical signals to maintain school cohesion, to coordinate movements, to warn of threats. A school of fish functions almost like a single organism, thousands of individuals responding to subtle chemical cues in the water around them. When one fish detects a predator and releases an alarm pheromone, the entire school reacts within seconds. No sound, no visual signal, just chemistry. This likely happened in ancient seas too. We know from fossil evidence that fish schooling behavior existed at least 360 million years ago. Blinded fish can integrate into schools, but fish with damaged lateral line systems cannot. That suggests coordination relies on multiple sensory inputs, including chemical detection. But chemical communication wasn't limited to fish. Invertebrates mastered it first. Crustaceans, for instance. Around 400 million years ago, crustaceans were already producing clicking sounds to communicate, but they were also releasing chemical signals. Modern crustaceans use pheromones extensively for mating, for establishing dominance hierarchies, for marking territories. Their ancient relatives almost certainly did the same. The neural architecture for detecting and responding to chemical signals is deeply embedded in crustacean biology. It's fundamental to how they interact with their environment. Mollusks, too. Cephalopods, the ancestors of modern squid and octopuses, likely used chemical signals alongside their more famous visual displays. Ink itself might have functioned as a chemical signal, not just a visual smokescreen. Some modern cephalopods release compounds in their ink that temporarily disrupt predator olfaction, essentially blinding them chemically while the cephalopod escapes. The real question is how sophisticated these chemical vocabularies became. How much information can you pack into a chemical signal? More than you'd think. Modern fish can encode information about their physiological state, their stress levels, their recent diet, their reproductive condition, all in a complex mixture of compounds. Receivers detect this mixture, process it, and extract multiple layers of meaning. It's not binary communication. It's gradient communication, nuanced communication. There's even evidence of chemical eavesdropping, predators detecting prey species' alarm pheromones and using them to locate concentrated groups of panicked fish. Prey species detecting predator metabolic byproducts and avoiding those areas. It's an evolutionary arms race conducted entirely in molecules. What makes chemical communication particularly fascinating is its interaction with ocean physics. The ocean isn't homogeneous. It's layered, stratified by temperature and salinity. These layers affect how chemicals diffuse and disperse. A pheromone released near the surface behaves differently than one released at depth. Currents create highways and eddies, fast lanes and dead zones. Ancient animals likely learned to exploit these patterns. Release a chemical signal in a strong current and it broadcasts widely but briefly. Release it in still water and it lingers locally. Release it at a thermocline boundary and it might get trapped, creating a persistent chemical marker in a specific depth range. This is sophisticated environmental manipulation. It requires understanding how the ocean moves, how layers form, how chemicals behave under different conditions. And yet animals without complex brains were doing this hundreds of millions of years ago. The persistence of chemical signals created something unique in ancient oceans, a chemical landscape. At any given moment, the water around an animal contained a mixture of signals: recent signals, old signals, local signals, signals carried from far away. An animal with good chemoreception could read this landscape like a map. That direction smells like food. That direction smells like danger. That area has been recently occupied by competitors. It's a form of communication that's almost impossible for us to visualize because we don't experience the world this way. We see and hear. We don't smell in 3 dimensions. We don't follow scent trails through space. But for many ancient ocean animals, chemical sensing was primary. Vision and hearing were supplementary. This shaped behavior in profound ways. Animals didn't need to see each other to coordinate. They didn't need to vocalize to warn others. They just released the right compounds and let the ocean carry the message. It was communication that worked in complete darkness, in murky water, across distances where no visual or acoustic signal could penetrate. And unlike sound, which requires relatively complex anatomy to produce, chemical signals were cheap. Any animal could release compounds. All it took was the right glands, the right metabolic pathways. Even simple organisms could participate in chemical communication networks. But there's a limitation: speed. Chemical signals travel slowly compared to sound or light. A pheromone might take minutes or hours to reach distant receivers. For immediate threats, for rapid coordination, chemistry is too slow. This is probably why acoustic communication evolved. It solved the speed problem. But it didn't replace chemical communication. The two systems coexisted, each filling different niches. Long-term information, persistent warnings, gradual coordination. Chemistry handled those. Immediate alerts, rapid exchanges, precise timing. Acoustics handled those. Animals that could use both systems had significant advantages. Some ancient fish likely integrated chemical and acoustic signals. A predator approaches. The threatened fish releases alarm pheromones, a persistent warning that lingers. Simultaneously, it produces sharp acoustic pulses, an immediate alert. Nearby fish respond to the sound instantly. Distant fish, or fish downwind in the current, encounter the chemical signal later and adjust their behavior accordingly. 2 communication channels, 2 timescales, complementary functions. There's even speculation about chemical amplification of acoustic signals. Certain compounds might make auditory receptors more sensitive or change how an animal interprets sounds. Release the right pheromone and suddenly acoustic signals carry different meanings. It's a form of context setting, where chemistry modulates how acoustics are perceived. None of this is preserved in fossils, of course. We infer it from modern analogues, from the presence of sensory structures, from ecological logic, but the inference is strong. Chemical communication was fundamental to ancient ocean life. It shaped predator-prey dynamics, mating systems, social structures, migration patterns, and it's still happening. Every ocean animal living today participates in chemical communication networks. Sharks detecting blood from miles away, fish homing to natal streams using scent memories, crustaceans coordinating swarm behavior through pheromone clouds. The ancient system never disappeared. It just became invisible to humans who lack the sensory equipment to perceive it. This creates an interesting perspective shift. We tend to think of ancient oceans as quieter than modern oceans, less filled with the acoustic noise of whales and dolphins. But chemically, ancient oceans might have been even richer, even more information dense. Millions of species broadcasting continuously, creating a complex chemical atmosphere that we can't see or smell or measure in fossils. The ocean wasn't just full of life, it was full of messages, layered messages, persistent messages, messages that accumulated and overlapped and created a kind of chemical history of recent events. An animal swimming through ancient seas was swimming through information, constantly sampling, constantly updating its understanding of the world based on molecular evidence. Chemical communication also created opportunities for deception. If you can detect chemical signals, you can potentially fake them. Mimicry isn't just visual. Some modern fish release compounds that mimic other species, either to avoid predators or to approach prey, without triggering alarm responses. Ancient fish likely did the same. It's an evolutionary game of chemical forgery and detection. Then there's the question of chemical complexity over evolutionary time. Did chemical vocabularies expand? Did species develop more compounds, more combinations, more nuanced messages? Or did they simplify, converging on a few highly reliable signals? We don't know, but the trend in evolution is usually toward greater complexity when it provides advantages. More information generally beats less information, so it's reasonable to suspect that chemical communication became more sophisticated over time, at least in lineages where it remained important. What we do know is that chemical communication set the stage for everything that came after. Before animals could coordinate through sound, they coordinated through chemistry. Before they could signal with light, they signaled with molecules. Chemical communication was the foundation. Everything else was elaboration. Acoustic communication entered the ancient seas approximately 407 million years ago. That's when vertebrates developed the ability to produce and detect sound underwater. It wasn't a gradual process spread across multiple lineages. All acoustic communication in vertebrates descended from a single ancestor, meaning this happened once and then diversified. One evolutionary innovation that changed everything. Sound had been present in the ocean before this, obviously. Water moves, currents flow, waves crash, geological activity creates vibrations. But intentional sound production, controlled acoustic signaling that required specialized anatomy. And once it appeared, it spread rapidly because underwater acoustics offered something chemical communication couldn't match: speed. Sound travels through ocean water at approximately 1,450 meters per second. That's 5 times faster than sound in air. In a medium where visibility might be limited to a few meters, where chemical signals drift slowly with currents, acoustic signals moved almost instantaneously across considerable distances. An animal could broadcast its presence, its location, its intentions, and receive responses within seconds. Real-time communication became possible in ways chemistry couldn't achieve. This speed advantage reshaped predator-prey dynamics, mating systems, territorial behaviors. Everything accelerated. But speed wasn't the only advantage. Sound also offered range. In certain ocean conditions, acoustic signals could travel extraordinary distances. Temperature gradients in the water column create layers where sound bends and channels, trapping it in horizontal pathways that can extend for hundreds of kilometers. This phenomenon, known as the SOFAR channel, exists at the base of the thermocline, where temperature changes create optimal propagation conditions. Modern marine mammals exploit this channel extensively. Ancient animals probably did too, though proving it from fossils is impossible. Here's what we know happened around 400 million years ago. Crustaceans started making clicking sounds, small rhythmic percussive noises produced by specialized body parts snapping together. Why? Most likely for communication with each other, possibly for attracting mates or establishing territories. And early fishes, always looking for a meal, developed the ability to hear these clicks. Suddenly, there was an evolutionary arms race. Prey that made sound became detectable. Predators that could hear had advantages. Prey that could hear predators gained survival benefits. The acoustic landscape became relevant in ways it hadn't been before. The lateral line system was already present in early fish. This mechanosensory organ detects pressure changes and vibrations in surrounding water. And it's ancient, found in fish that diverged over 400 million years ago. The lateral line allowed fish to sense movement, to detect prey, to avoid collisions when swimming in groups. Blinded fish could still school effectively using their lateral lines. Fish with severed lateral lines couldn't. That tells you how fundamental this system was. But the lateral line only worked at close range, detecting near-field vibrations. For long-distance communication, something else was needed. That something else was true hearing. Ears. Inner ear structures that could detect far-field sound waves and translate them into neural signals. Once fish evolved these structures, acoustic communication exploded in complexity. Different species developed different sound-producing mechanisms. Some vibrated their swim bladders, creating low-frequency booms. Others ground their teeth together, producing sharp clicks or grating sounds. Still others used specialized muscles to drum against bony structures. The variety of mechanisms suggests that acoustic communication evolved multiple times, independently within fish lineages, each solving the problem differently. What were they saying? We can infer from modern fish behavior. Territorial warnings, mating calls, alarm signals, coordination calls for schooling behavior, parent-offspring communication, social recognition within groups. All the basic functions that acoustic communication serves today were likely present in ancient fish as well. The physics of sound hasn't changed. The ecological pressures haven't changed. The solutions probably haven't changed much either. One fascinating aspect of underwater acoustics is how environment shapes communication. Sound behaves differently depending on water temperature, salinity, depth, and substrate. Fish living in shallow coastal waters face different acoustic challenges than fish in the open ocean or deep-sea environments. Shallow water creates echoes and reverberations. Sound bounces off the bottom, off the surface, creating acoustic clutter. Deep water offers clearer channels, but requires more energy to produce loud enough signals. Different habitats selected for different vocal strategies. There's also the question of acoustic masking. When many animals are producing sound simultaneously, how do you hear the signals that matter? Modern fish solve this through frequency partitioning. Different species vocalize at different frequencies, creating acoustic niches just as they occupy physical niches. Some fish call in low frequency ranges, others in high frequencies. This reduces overlap and allows multiple species to communicate in the same space without constant interference. Ancient fish probably did the same thing, though we can't measure their call frequencies directly. What we can measure is hearing range. Fossilized ear structures reveals something about what frequencies an animal could detect. By examining the size and shape of inner ear components, researchers can estimate the functional hearing range of extinct species. It's not perfect, but it provides boundaries. An animal with small, tightly coiled cochlear structures probably heard high frequencies. An animal with large, loosely structured inner ears probably specialized in low-frequency detection. These anatomical clues tell us that different prehistoric fish occupied different acoustic niches, just as modern fish do. The Devonian period, often called the Age of Fishes, saw explosive diversification in both fish anatomy and presumably fish communication. Jawhead fish reached substantial diversity during this time. And we have trace fossil evidence of communication-related behavior. Large radial patterns preserved in Upper Devonian sediments may represent structures made by male fish to attract females. If true, these are the first known examples of courtship behavior in the fish fossil record, suggesting that elaborate mating displays existed at least 360 million years ago. Visual displays, acoustic displays, or both? We don't know. But communication was clearly important enough to leave marks in the geological record. Sharks, which appeared early in fish evolution, likely used acoustic communication as well. Modern sharks are generally quiet animals, but they do produce sounds in certain contexts, and they definitely detect sounds produced by others. Their hearing is acute, particularly for low-frequency vibrations associated with struggling prey. Ancient sharks probably had similar capabilities. Some extinct sharks had bizarre anatomical features that might have served communication functions. Stethecanthus, for example, had a strange anvil-shaped spine on its back, covered in tooth-like structures. Nobody knows what this was for, but one hypothesis involves visual or acoustic signaling. Displaying this structure might have communicated size, maturity, or aggressive intent to other sharks. Body language was likely important too. Modern sharks use posture and movement to communicate, arching the back, dropping the pectoral fins, swimming in exaggerated patterns. All these behaviors convey information. Stethecanthus might have used its unusual spine in similar displays, either intimidating rivals or attracting mates. The point is that communication wasn't limited to one modality. Visual, acoustic, chemical, all could operate simultaneously, each conveying different information or reinforcing the same message through multiple channels. This brings us to a critical realization about ancient ocean communication. It wasn't simple, and it wasn't primitive. By the Devonian, fish had already developed sophisticated multimodal communication systems involving multiple sensory channels, complex behaviors, and species-specific signals. They could coordinate group movements, establish social hierarchies, attract mates, defend territories, warn of danger. All the fundamental communication functions were present. The neural processing required for these behaviors was present. The ocean was already filled with information, with messages, with meaning, and it kept evolving. As fish diversified, communication systems diversified with them. Different lineages experimented with different solutions. Some fish became highly vocal, filling their environments with constant chatter. Others remained relatively silent, relying more on visual or chemical cues. Some developed specialized structures for amplifying sound. Others evolved acute hearing to detect faint signals. There was no single best strategy. Context mattered. Ecology mattered. What worked in one environment or lifestyle didn't work in another. Then marine reptiles entered the picture. These were air-breathing animals that returned to the ocean, bringing terrestrial adaptations with them. How did they communicate? Fossils suggest multiple approaches. Some marine reptiles, particularly sea turtles, likely used vocalizations. Sound production in modern turtles is often related to mating, and ancient turtles probably did the same. Roaring, grunting, or bellowing, produced by forcing air through a modified glottis while the mouth remained closed. These sounds would travel well underwater, especially at low frequencies. Potential mates could hear them from considerable distances. Other marine reptiles took a different approach entirely. Temnodontosaurus, a massive ichthyosaur, evolved adaptations for silent swimming. Its flippers had a distinctive wing-like shape with a serrated trailing edge and no bones in the distal end. This configuration minimized turbulence and sound production during swimming. Why would a predator evolve to be silent? Because stealth hunting requires acoustic invisibility. If you're trying to approach prey undetected, every sound you make is a liability. Temnodontosaurus essentially became an underwater stealth bomber, moving through the ocean without acoustic signature. That's the opposite of communication. That's communication avoidance. But it tells us something important. By the Mesozoic, the ocean was acoustically rich enough that silence had become valuable. You could hide in quiet just as you could hide in darkness. Plesiosaurs, mosasaurs, other marine reptiles, we don't know much about their acoustic behavior. They had ears, so they could hear. Whether they vocalized remains speculative. Fossilization doesn't preserve soft tissue vocal structures. We're left inferring from ecology and modern analogues. Marine reptiles that hunted in groups might have needed coordination calls. Species with complex social structures probably communicated acoustically. Solitary ambush predators might have remained mostly silent. Each lifestyle selects for different communication strategies. What's becoming clear is that by the Mesozoic, the ocean contained multiple overlapping communication systems. Fish were vocalizing, crustaceans were clicking. Marine reptiles might have been calling. Marine mammals hadn't appeared yet, but when they did, they would add yet another layer, each group using sound differently for different purposes, at different frequencies. The acoustic environment was becoming increasingly complex, increasingly crowded, and that complexity created new evolutionary pressures. How do you communicate effectively in a noisy environment? How do you ensure your signals reach their intended receivers without being drowned out by background noise or intercepted by eavesdropping predators? These questions drove the continuing evolution of acoustic communication. Animals developed more distinctive calls, more species-specific signals that couldn't be confused with others. They evolved better frequency discrimination, sharper hearing that could pick out relevant sounds from ambient noise. They adjusted their calling behavior, vocalizing more during quiet periods or in acoustic windows where interference was minimal. Communication became a strategic challenge, not just a biological capability. And the animals that solved this challenge most effectively were the ones whose lineages thrived. The arrival of marine mammals changed everything. When ancestral whales returned to the ocean around 50 million years ago, they brought terrestrial adaptations with them. Air-breathing lungs, warm blood, complex social behaviors, and ears designed for hearing in air, not water. Those ears had to be completely reimagined. Sound behaves differently underwater. It travels faster, refracts differently, penetrates tissues in ways it doesn't in air. The bones and membranes that worked perfectly on land became liabilities in the ocean. So evolution went to work. Within less than 10 million years, whale ears had transformed. Remingtonocetids and protocetids were among the first to develop genuine underwater hearing. Sound reached their inner ears through the mandibular fat pad, a specialized tissue that conducted vibrations to the tympanic plate and middle ear ossicles. This was radically different from terrestrial hearing, where sound waves entered through an external ear canal. In water, that design doesn't work. The impedance mismatch between water and air-filled ear canals creates massive signal loss. But fat has acoustic properties similar to water. Sound waves pass through it efficiently, losing minimal energy in the transfer. The mandibular fat pad became an acoustic lens, focusing sound waves onto the hearing apparatus. Brilliant adaptation. By the late Middle Eocene, basilosaurid archaeocetes had evolved acoustically isolated ear bones. These bones were separated from the skull, creating independent hearing channels for each ear. That isolation was critical. On land, animals can determine sound direction because their ears are separated by their head, creating slight timing and intensity differences between what each ear hears. Underwater, sound travels, alas so fast that those differences become negligible. Your ears are too close together to detect the tiny delays. But if you acoustically isolate each ear from the skull, preventing sound from conducting through bone between them, suddenly directional hearing becomes possible again. Each ear receives sound independently. The brain can compare signals and triangulate the source. This gave early whales directional underwater hearing at low to mid frequencies, a massive competitive advantage for animals that hunted by sound. Then came echolocation. This wasn't just hearing. This was active acoustic sensing, biological sonar that allowed toothed whales to see with sound. The innovation appeared around 39 million years ago, likely soon after Odontocetes diverged from baleen whale ancestors. Archaic toothed whales possessed cochleae specialized for sensing high-frequency sound, strong evidence they had functional biosonar systems from the very beginning. This was a key innovation that facilitated explosive phylogenetic diversification. Echolocation allowed whales to hunt in complete darkness, navigate through murky water, distinguish between prey species, even assess the internal structure of objects by analyzing returning echoes. It was perception on an entirely different level. Interestingly, echolocation evolved twice independently within whale lineages, once in Xenorophus, an Oligocene stem odontocete, and once in Crown Odontocetes. Convergent evolution, the same solution arising separately because the selective pressures were identical. If you're a predator in the ocean, acoustic sensing provides overwhelming advantages. The ability to generate and interpret high-frequency clicks transformed these animals into apex predators. They could detect fish buried in sand, navigate through pitch-black depths, coordinate group hunts through acoustic signals. Other marine mammals followed different paths. Seals and sea lions retained better vision, relying on visual hunting in clearer waters. But they still developed excellent underwater hearing. Their ears adapted differently than whale ears, but the functional outcome was similar: enhanced sensitivity to underwater sound, particularly at frequencies relevant to prey detection and social communication. Marine mammal vocalizations became increasingly sophisticated. These weren't pill calls. They were complex, modulated, information-rich signals. Whale songs could last for hours, containing repeating patterns and themes that changed over time. Geographic populations developed distinct dialects. Individuals could be recognized by their unique vocal signatures. This was communication approaching language-like complexity, though calling it language would be anthropomorphizing. Still, the information density was remarkable. What drove this sophistication? Social complexity. Marine mammals, particularly whales and dolphins, live in intricate social structures. They form long-term bonds, coordinate group activities, care for each other's young, engage in cooperative hunting. That social complexity demands robust communication systems. You can't maintain relationships, negotiate hierarchies, or coordinate behavior without effective signaling. And in the ocean, acoustic signals are the most reliable option. Chemical signals diffuse and degrade. Visual signals don't travel far. But sound propagates for miles, even hundreds of miles under the right conditions. There's an acoustic phenomenon called the SOFAR channel, a horizontal layer in the ocean where temperature and pressure create optimal conditions for sound propagation. Refraction traps sound waves within this channel, allowing them to travel enormous distances with minimal energy loss. Marine mammals may use this phenomenon extensively for long-distance communication. A whale calling in the SOFAR channel could potentially be heard by other whales thousands of miles away. We're only beginning to understand how much they might be exploiting this. The acoustic environment these animals inhabit is vastly more complex than we initially realized. The ocean isn't silent, it's filled with sound. Biological sounds from countless marine organisms. Geological sounds from underwater volcanic activity, earthquakes, shifting sediments. Physical sounds from waves, rain, ice. And now, increasingly, anthropogenic sounds from ships, sonar, industrial activity. This creates a noisy, crowded acoustic landscape where effective communication requires sophisticated signal design. Marine mammals address this challenge through multiple strategies. They developed highly distinctive calls that stand out from background noise. They use frequency ranges where ambient noise is lower. They adjust their calling behavior based on environmental conditions, vocalizing more when conditions are favorable, less when interference is high. They've evolved remarkable frequency discrimination, the ability to pick out relevant signals from cacophonous backgrounds. Some species can detect sounds at signal-to-noise ratios that seem physically impossible, suggesting neural processing capabilities we don't fully understand. The evolution of these communication systems wasn't isolated from other adaptations. Brain size increased dramatically in marine mammals, particularly in odontocetes. Dolphins have brain-to-body mass ratios comparable to great apes. The neocortex, associated with higher cognitive functions, is highly developed. This neural architecture supports complex acoustic processing, social cognition, and behavioral flexibility. There's an evolutionary feedback loop here. Social complexity drives communication sophistication, which requires enhanced neural processing, which enables more complex social behaviors, which drives further communication evolution. Each component reinforces the others. The result is animals with cognitive and communicative abilities that rival, and in some domains possibly exceed, those of terrestrial mammals. But let's zoom out. We've been focusing on individual lineages, specific adaptations, particular communication modes. What about the bigger picture? How did all these different systems interact? The Mesozoic and Cenozoic oceans contained an incredible diversity of communicating organisms. Fish vocalizing at various frequencies, crustaceans producing clicks and snaps, marine reptiles possibly calling during breeding seasons, marine mammals whistling, clicking, singing, cephalopods flashing bioluminescent displays, each group operating in overlapping acoustic and visual spaces. Did they interfere with each other? Almost certainly. Acoustic masking, where one signal obscures another, must have been common. Species that used similar frequency ranges would have competed for acoustic space, driving divergence in call structure. This is acoustic niche partitioning, the same principle that applies to physical niches. If two species can't coexist using identical resources, they'll diverge to exploit different ones. In this case, the resource is acoustic bandwidth. Predators likely eavesdropped on prey communication. If fish are vocalizing during spawning aggregations, any predator that can hear those calls gains information about prey location and abundance. This creates selection pressure on prey to communicate more quietly, more briefly, or at frequencies predators say and detect easily. Counter-adaptations follow. Predators evolve better hearing in those frequency ranges. Prey shift again. It's an evolutionary arms race played out in acoustic space. Some species likely engaged in acoustic deception, mimicking the calls of other species to confuse, intimidate, or attract them. We see this in modern animals. Orcas can mimic the calls of other whale species, possibly to approach them without triggering alarm. Prehistoric marine predators might have employed similar tactics. Evidence? Hard to find in the fossil record. But the selective advantages are clear, and evolution tends to discover advantageous strategies repeatedly. Chemical communication added another layer. Pheromones and other chemical signals conveyed information that sound and light couldn't. Reproductive state, individual identity, stress levels, territorial boundaries. These chemical messages dispersed through ocean currents, creating invisible information networks. Animals could track chemical trails to locate mates or food sources. They could assess the health and genetic quality of potential partners through chemical cues. They could recognize kin versus non-kin, crucial for social species where cooperation depends on relatedness. The integration of multiple sensory modalities created robust, redundant communication systems. If acoustic signals failed due to noise, visual or chemical signals provided backup. If water turbidity reduced visibility, animals relied more heavily on sound and chemistry. This multimodal approach maximized communication reliability across varying environmental conditions. Clear tropical reefs favored visual displays. Murky estuaries enhanced chemical and acoustic importance. Deep oceanic environments, where light doesn't penetrate, made sound and bioluminescence essential. Each habitat selected for different communication strategies, but most animals retained multiple options. Flexibility mattered. The ancient oceans weren't static. Sea levels rose and fell. Climate shifted. Currents changed. Ice ages came and went. Asteroid impacts caused mass extinctions. Animals that could adapt their communication strategies to changing conditions survived. Those locked into narrow approaches didn't. This brings us to a critical point. Communication isn't just about exchanging information. It's about surviving in a complex, dangerous, ever-changing world. The animals that developed the most sophisticated communication systems were often the ones that faced the most challenging environments or the most complex social landscapes. Dolphins hunting in coordinated groups needed better communication than solitary ambush predators. Whales migrating across ocean basins needed long-distance calling abilities that coastal species didn't. Deep-sea fish living in perpetual darkness required bioluminescent signaling that shallow water species could ignore. Each ecological challenge drove specific communicative innovations. And here's something fascinating. Many of these innovations emerged independently multiple times in unrelated lineages. Bioluminescence evolved separately in numerous groups. Acoustic communication appeared independently in fish, marine reptiles, and marine mammals. Electroreception arose in different fish lineages. This convergent evolution reveals something profound. The ocean, with its specific physical properties and ecological challenges, consistently selects for certain communication solutions. The medium shapes the message. Sound works well underwater, so acoustic communication evolves repeatedly. Light penetrates poorly into deep water, so bioluminescence becomes valuable. Electric fields propagate effectively in conductive seawater, so electroreception appears. The constraints and opportunities of the marine environment guide evolution toward predictable outcomes. Different starting points, different genetic toolkits, different evolutionary histories, but similar endpoints. That's not coincidence. That's physics and ecology determining what works. Now, you might be wondering about one group we haven't discussed much. Cephalopods, squid, octopuses, cuttlefish, nautiluses, and their extinct relatives like ammonites. These animals took a completely different approach to communication, one that deserves attention because it reveals yet another pathway evolution discovered. Cephalopods are masters of visual communication, but not through bioluminescence alone. They possess specialized skin cells called chromatophores, iridophores, and leucophores that allow rapid, precise control over coloration and pattern. A cuttlefish can change its entire body pattern in less than a second, shifting from camouflage to a bold display to a different camouflage pattern without pausing. This is visual communication at speeds that seem almost impossible. Modern cephalopods use these displays for courtship, aggression, camouflage, and possibly even intraspecific communication we don't fully understand. Males display vibrant patterns to attract females or intimidate rivals. Females signal receptivity or rejection through color changes. Some species produce polarized light patterns that only other cephalopods can see, creating a private communication channel invisible to most predators. Did ancient cephalopods possess similar capabilities? The soft tissue doesn't fossilize, so we can't know for certain, but the ecological pressures were similar. Ammonites lived in complex marine environments, competed for mates, avoided predators. Chromatophore-based communication would have provided significant advantages. It's reasonable to infer they possessed at least rudimentary versions of what we see in modern species. The same principle applies to extinct groups. Ammonites dominated marine environments for over 300 million years, surviving multiple mass extinctions before their final disappearance. Their shells show enormous diversity in size, shape, and ornamentation. Some species had smooth shells, others displayed elaborate ridges, spines, or tubercles. These external features weren't random. They served functions related to buoyancy, hydrodynamics, and possibly defense. But could they also have played roles in visual communication? Consider sexual dimorphism. In many ammonite species, males and females had distinctly different shell morphologies. Males were often smaller, with different ornamentation patterns. This dimorphism suggests mate recognition was important. Visual differences helped individuals identify appropriate partners. In clear water environments where many ammonites lived, distinctive shell patterns could function as species-specific signals. Combine that with potential chromatophore-based color displays, and you have a sophisticated visual communication system. Ink preservation in fossil cephalopods provides another clue. Ink sacs, occasionally found fossilized within ammonite and belemnite specimens, indicate these animals possess defensive ink capabilities, similar to modern squid and cuttlefish. But ink serves multiple functions in living cephalopods. Yes, it obscures vision and confuses predators, but it can also be used in communication, released in specific patterns or contexts that convey information to other members of the same species. We can't observe ammonite behavior directly, right? But we can make informed inferences based on their anatomy, their living relatives, and the ecological contexts they inhabited. Everything points towards sophisticated communication capabilities. Now let's shift perspective entirely. We've discussed how animals send signals, but communication is a two-way street. Receiving and interpreting signals matters just as much as producing them. The evolution of sensory systems, the neural processing required to extract meaning from signals, and the behavioral responses to communication, these represent the other half of the equation. Take hearing. Detecting sound requires specialized anatomical structures. Early fish developed simple ear structures capable of detecting low-frequency vibrations. As acoustic communication became more important, hearing became more sophisticated. The lateral line system, which detects pressure waves and water movement, evolved into a sensitive array of mechanoreceptors running along the body. This system allowed fish to detect approaching predators, locate prey, and sense the movements of schoolmates even in complete darkness or murky water. The lateral line is ancient. It appears in fish that diverged over 400 million years ago. This sensory system enabled coordination within schools. Blinded fish can still integrate into schools successfully because their lateral lines provide the spatial information they need. But fish with severed lateral lines cannot. They lose the ability to sense their neighbors' movements and positions. This demonstrates how critical mechanosensory communication was for social behavior in prehistoric seas. As fish diversified, hearing evolved in multiple directions. Some species developed enhanced low-frequency hearing for detecting predator movements. Others evolved sensitivity to higher frequencies, useful for detecting prey or conspecific calls. The swim bladder, originally an organ for buoyancy control, became acoustically coupled to the inner ear in many species, functioning as a resonance chamber that amplified sound. This innovation dramatically improved hearing sensitivity. But here's where it gets interesting. Hearing and sound production co-evolved. As some fish developed better hearing, there was selective pressure for more effective sound production. And as sound production became more sophisticated, better hearing became advantageous. This created a feedback loop, an evolutionary arms race where communication abilities escalated on both sides. The same dynamic occurred with other sensory modalities. As bioluminescent signals became more common, visual systems adapted to detect them more effectively. Deep-sea fish evolved enhanced sensitivity to blue and green wavelengths, the colors that penetrate deepest into water. Some developed tubular eyes that maximize light-gathering ability in near-total darkness. Others evolved specialized photoreceptors tuned to detect the specific wavelengths produced by bioluminescent prey or potential mates. Chemical communication drove olfactory evolution. Fish developed increasingly sensitive chemoreceptors capable of detecting minute concentrations of specific molecules. Salmon can detect their natal stream's unique chemical signature from vast distances, navigating thousands of miles to return to their birthplace. This requires extraordinary olfactory sensitivity and sophisticated neural processing to distinguish their home stream's signature from thousands of other chemical profiles encountered during migration. Sharks took chemical detection to extremes. Their olfactory systems are so sensitive they can detect blood at concentrations of 1 part per million. That's equivalent to detecting a single drop of blood, diluted in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. This isn't just prey detection, it's also communication. Sharks can detect pheromones released by potential mates or rivals, extracting detailed information about reproductive status, health, and identity from chemical traces in the water. Electroreception represents perhaps the most alien sensory modality from a human perspective. We simply don't perceive electric fields. But for sharks and certain other fish, electroreception provides a rich information channel. The ampullae of Lorenzini, specialized organs distributed around a shark's head, detect the weak electric fields generated by living organisms. Every muscle contraction, every heartbeat, every neural impulse produces electrical activity. Sharks sense these bioelectric fields. This sensory system evolved over 400 million years ago. It's ancient, appearing in early cartilaginous fish and some bony fish lineages. Initially, electroreception probably served primarily for prey detection. A flatfish buried in sand, invisible to vision, still produces detectable electric fields. Sharks hunt these hidden prey with remarkable precision, guided entirely by electroreception. But electroreception also enables communication. Some fish can modulate their electric field production, creating patterns and pulses that convey information. Weakly electric fish in modern freshwater environments use this capability extensively, generating species-specific electric signals for courtship and territorial displays. While we have less direct evidence for this in ancient marine species, the sensory apparatus was present. The capability existed. Processing all this sensory information required sophisticated nervous systems. Fish brains evolved specialized regions for handling inputs from different sensory modalities. The optic tectum processes visual information. The olfactory bulbs handle chemical signals. The lateral line nuclei process mechanosensory data. These brain regions became increasingly complex as communication demands grew. Neural processing isn't just about detecting signals, it's about interpreting them correctly. A sound might indicate a predator, a prey item, or a potential mate. The animal must extract meaning from the raw sensory data, categorize it, and respond appropriately. This requires learning, memory, and decision-making capabilities. Evidence suggests even ancient fish possess these cognitive abilities. Trace fossils from the Devonian show structured patterns that may represent courtship displays, males creating specific visual patterns to attract females. This implies mate choice, evaluation of signal quality, and behavioral flexibility. The males that produced the most attractive displays gained mating advantages. Females that could evaluate display quality and choose the best mates produced more successful offspring. This cognitive dimension of communication often gets overlooked. We focus on the signals themselves, the sounds, colors, and chemical compounds. But the neural machinery that processes these signals and generates appropriate responses is equally important. Communication requires intelligence, even if we're talking about fish intelligence rather than human intelligence. Social learning added another layer of complexity. Young animals learned communication signals from parents or social groups. Whale songs vary between populations, with regional dialects passed from generation to generation. This cultural transmission of communication patterns appears in various marine species. It's not all hardwired instinct. Some communication behaviors are learned, modified, and transmitted socially. This has profound implications. It means communication systems could evolve culturally, not just genetically. Populations could develop local variations in their signals, creating communication barriers between groups. Over time, these barriers might contribute to reproductive isolation and ultimately speciation. Communication doesn't just reflect evolutionary divergence, it can drive it. Let's consider one more dimension of ancient ocean communication: deception. Not all signals convey honest information. Natural selection sometimes favors dishonesty. An animal might benefit from mimicking another species' warning signals without actually being dangerous, or from exaggerating its size, health, or fighting ability to intimidate rivals or attract mates. Anglerfish exemplify deceptive communication. Their bioluminescent lures mimic prey items, attracting small fish within striking range. This is communication used for predation, exploiting the sensory biases of prey species. The prey sees what appears to be a meal. Instead, it becomes one. Mimicry represents another form of deception. Some harmless species evolved to resemble dangerous ones, borrowing their warning signals without paying the costs of actually being toxic or well defended. In marine environments, this might involve mimicking coloration patterns, body shapes, or movement patterns of dangerous species. Even within species, deception occurs. Males might signal greater size or strength than they actually possess, bluffing their way through confrontations. Females might signal receptivity to multiple males, securing benefits from several partners. Not all communication is honest, and evolution doesn't require it to be. What matters is whether the strategy works, whether it increases reproductive success. This creates another evolutionary dynamic. As deceptive signals become common, receivers evolve skepticism. They demand more reliable, harder to fake signals. This drives signal elaboration. Honest signalers must find ways to demonstrate their quality that dishonest signalers cannot easily mimic. This might involve costly displays, signals that require substantial energy investment or risk. Only individuals in genuinely good condition can afford these expensive signals. The result is an ongoing evolutionary dance between signalers and receivers, honesty and deception, signal and skepticism. Communication systems don't reach stable endpoints. They keep evolving, shaped by conflicting selective pressures. All of this, the sensory systems, the neural processing, the learning, the deception, it reminds us that communication is not simple. It's not just making noise or flashing lights. It's a complex interaction between signalers and receivers, embedded in ecological contexts, shaped by millions of years of evolution, and requiring sophisticated cognitive and physiological machinery. The prehistoric oceans were filled with these interactions. Countless species, each with their own communication systems, coexisting in the same environments. Sometimes their signals interfered with each other, creating noise that made communication harder. Other times, species eavesdropped on each other's signals, extracting useful information. Predators learned to recognize prey distress calls. Prey learned to recognize predator vocalizations. This created acoustic communities, groups of species whose communication systems influenced each other. Changes in one species' signaling could cascade through the community, affecting how other species communicated. The soundscape of ancient oceans was a constantly shifting tapestry of biological signals, each thread woven into a larger pattern. Human activity has dramatically altered modern ocean soundscapes. Ship noise, sonar, seismic surveys, and industrial activities have increased background noise levels substantially. This acoustic pollution interferes with marine animal communication, particularly for species that rely on long-distance acoustic signals. Whales must call louder or more frequently to be heard over anthropogenic noise. Some populations have shifted their vocal frequencies, trying to find quieter acoustic spaces. This highlights how dependent marine communication is on environmental conditions. The prehistoric oceans were quieter. Natural sounds, waves, rain, ice, earthquakes provided the acoustic background. But human-generated noise didn't exist. Animals could communicate across vast distances with less interference. The loss of this acoustic clarity represents an underappreciated impact of human activity on marine ecosystems. Understanding ancient ocean communication isn't just academic curiosity. It provides context for what we're changing in modern oceans. It shows us what these systems looked like before human influence. And it reminds us that communication is fundamental to how marine animals live, reproduce, and survive. Disrupting these systems has consequences we're only beginning to understand. Looking back at these ancient communication systems reveals something profound about the nature of life itself. Communication isn't a luxury feature that evolved after organisms got comfortable with basic survival. It's foundational. From the earliest multicellular organisms coordinating their cellular activities to the most sophisticated whale songs spanning ocean basins, the ability to send and receive information has driven evolutionary success as much as any physical adaptation. Consider what it took for communication to emerge in the first place. You need organisms complex enough to produce signals, sensory systems capable of detecting those signals, and neural processing sophisticated enough to extract meaning. This requires substantial investment. Building and maintaining sensory organs consumes energy. Processing information requires neural tissue, metabolically expensive stuff that demands constant fuel. So why bother? Because the payoff is enormous. An organism that can detect predators before seeing them gains survival time. An organism that can advertise its quality to potential mates increases reproductive success. An organism that can coordinate with others accesses resources unavailable to solitary individuals. The fossil record shows us when key innovations appeared. Trilobite eyes, over 500 million years old, represent some of the earliest complex visual systems. These weren't simple light detectors. They were compound eyes with thousands of individual lenses, capable of forming images and detecting movement. This level of sophistication didn't evolve for navigation alone. It evolved for interaction. Trilobites needed to see each other, to recognize conspecifics, to avoid predators, to locate prey. Vision became a communication channel, and body patterns, movements, and displays could convey information across distances. The lateral line system in early fish, traceable back over 400 million years, demonstrates another evolutionary investment in communication infrastructure. This system detects pressure changes and water movements, allowing fish to sense their surroundings even in complete darkness. But it also detects the movements of other fish. Schools coordinate their movements through lateral line sensing, thousands of individuals moving as one without colliding. This collective behavior requires each fish to constantly monitor the pressure waves generated by its neighbors, adjusting its own movements in real time. The cognitive processing involved is staggering, yet it happens automatically, unconsciously, the result of millions of years of evolutionary refinement. Chemical communication likely predates all others. Even single-celled organisms respond to chemical gradients, moving toward nutrients and away from toxins. As organisms became more complex, chemical signaling became more sophisticated. Pheromones could convey specific messages, reproductive status, territorial ownership, alarm signals, individual identity. The advantage of chemical signals is persistence. Unlike sound or light, which disappear instantly when the source stops, chemical signals linger. They can mark territories, leave trails, provide information about who passed through an area hours or days earlier. For organisms without sophisticated sensory systems, chemical communication provided a reliable, low-energy way to interact with their environment and each other. Sound communication emerged later, requiring specialized structures for both production and reception. But once it evolved, it offered unique advantages. Sound travels far in water, especially at certain frequencies and depths. The SOFAR channel, where temperature and pressure conditions trap sound waves, allows acoustic signals to travel hundreds or thousands of miles with minimal attenuation. Early whales discovered this acoustic highway and exploited it brilliantly. Their songs, produced at frequencies that match the SOFAR channel's optimal transmission range, can theoretically be heard across entire ocean basins. This transforms the ocean from a vast, isolating space into an acoustic commons where individuals separated by enormous distances can still communicate. The convergent evolution of echolocation in toothed whales represents one of the most remarkable communication innovations. Around 39 million years ago, ancestral Odontocetes developed the ability to produce high-frequency clicks and interpret the returning echoes. This biosonar system provides detailed three-dimensional information about the environment, far more precise than vision in murky or dark waters. But it's also computationally intensive. The brain must send out a click, wait for echoes, analyze their timing and frequency characteristics, construct a mental image of the surroundings, and do all this continuously while swimming, hunting, and interacting with other whales. The neural machinery required is extraordinary, and whale brains reflect this investment. The auditory processing centers are massive, highly specialized regions dedicated to making sense of acoustic information. What's striking is how quickly these systems evolved once the selective pressure existed. Whale ears transitioned from terrestrial hearing to underwater hearing in less than 10 million years. That's geologically rapid, a blink of evolutionary time. The driving force was clear. Whales that could hear better underwater had enormous advantages. They could communicate across distances, coordinate hunting, avoid dangers, find mates. Those advantages translated directly into reproductive success, and natural selection did the rest. Bioluminescence offers another window into communication evolution. Light production evolved independently dozens of times across different lineages, suggesting it solves fundamental problems. In the deep ocean, where sunlight never penetrates, bioluminescence becomes the primary source of illumination. Organisms use it for everything: attracting prey, deterring predators, finding mates, and communicating with conspecifics. The biochemical pathways that produce bioluminescence are complex, requiring specialized proteins and chemical reactions. Yet evolution found these solutions repeatedly, each time crafting light-producing systems from available genetic and biochemical raw materials. The integration of multiple communication modalities shows evolutionary sophistication. Rather than relying on a single sensory channel, successful species used whatever worked best in their specific environment. Coastal species in clear water emphasized visual signals, body coloration, postures, movements. Species in murky estuaries relied more heavily on chemical and acoustic cues. Deep-sea species combined bioluminescence with other modalities, creating redundant communication systems that functioned even when individual channels failed. This flexibility, this ability to mix and match sensory modalities based on ecological context, demonstrates that communication systems aren't rigid, they're adaptive, shaped by environmental pressures and opportunities. The social implications of sophisticated communication cannot be overstated. Communication enables cooperation, and cooperation enables complexity. Look at modern dolphins, with their intricate social structures, alliances that form and dissolve, cooperative hunting strategies that require precise coordination. None of this would be possible without sophisticated communication. Each individual must understand not just basic signals, but context, nuance, individual identity. They must recognize dozens or hundreds of other individuals, remember past interactions, predict future behavior based on social dynamics. This requires cognitive abilities that rival or exceed those of many primates. Did prehistoric marine animals possess similar social sophistication? The evidence suggests many did. Fossil sites showing mass strandings of ichthyosaurs or groups of mosasaurs hint at social behavior. Modern analogues like whales and dolphins demonstrate what's possible with marine social structures. It's reasonable to infer that at least some prehistoric marine reptiles and early cetaceans lived in complex social groups, coordinating their activities through communication systems as sophisticated as those we see today. The evolutionary arms race between signalers and receivers created pressure for ever more sophisticated systems. As receivers became better at detecting signals, signalers had to produce clearer, stronger, or more complex signals to be noticed. This drove signal elaboration, the evolution of increasingly conspicuous displays. But it also drove receiver sophistication, better sensory organs, more complex neural processing, enhanced discrimination abilities. Neither signalers nor receivers could afford to stand still. Each improvement on one side created selective pressure on the other, pushing both toward greater complexity. Deception added another layer to this evolutionary dynamic. Once communication systems existed, opportunities for exploitation emerged. Mimics could produce false signals, gaining benefits without paying costs. This created selection for skepticism, for receivers that could distinguish honest signals from dishonest ones. Honest signalers responded by making their signals harder to fake, incorporating costs that only high-quality individuals could afford. This back and forth between honesty and deception, signal and skepticism, has been ongoing for hundreds of millions of years, shaping communication systems in ways we're still working to understand. The loss of acoustic clarity in modern oceans represents a profound disruption to systems that evolved over geological timescales. Marine animals adapted to specific acoustic environments, to background noise levels determined by natural sources like waves, rain, and geological activity. Human-generated noise, ship engines, sonar, seismic surveys, exists at frequencies and intensities that never occurred naturally. Animals cannot simply adapt to these changes on human timescales. Evolution requires generations, hundreds or thousands of years for significant adaptations to spread through populations. We've altered ocean soundscapes in decades. The consequences ripple through ecosystems. Whales that cannot hear each other's calls fail to coordinate. Fish that cannot detect predator sounds experience higher mortality. Species that rely on acoustic cues for navigation become disoriented. These aren't minor inconveniences. They're fundamental disruptions to how these animals perceive and interact with their world. Studying ancient communication systems helps us understand what we're changing and why it matters. It provides a baseline, a reference point for what ocean soundscapes were like before industrialization. What emerges from all this is a picture of oceans as communication networks. Vast spaces filled with organisms constantly sending and receiving information. Every click, every flash of bioluminescence, every chemical plume, every pressure wave represents an attempt to influence the world, to convey information, to coordinate behavior. These signals overlap, interfere, sometimes complement each other, creating acoustic and chemical and visual landscapes as complex as any terrestrial habitat. The prehistoric oceans were quieter in some ways, lacking human noise, but they were never silent. They hummed with biological activity, with life announcing its presence and intentions. Understanding this history enriches our appreciation for what exists today. Modern marine communication systems aren't static endpoints. They're the latest chapter in an ongoing evolutionary story that stretches back 500 million years. The mechanisms have been refined, elaborated, sometimes simplified, always adapted to changing conditions. But the fundamental principles remain. Organisms need to exchange information. Evolution provides the tools. Natural selection shapes those tools based on what works. The story of prehistoric ocean communication is ultimately a story about connection, about organisms reaching across space to interact, coordinate, compete, cooperate, about evolution solving the problem of isolation in a vast medium, creating sensory systems and signaling mechanisms that allow life to find life. These systems made possible everything that followed: the complex social structures, the coordinated behaviors, the ecological relationships that define marine ecosystems. Without communication, the oceans would be very different places, populated by solitary organisms pursuing individual survival strategies without reference to each other. That's the real lesson here. Communication isn't peripheral to marine life. It's central. It shaped how species evolved, how ecosystems function, how life persists in an environment that seems, from our terrestrial perspective, alien and inhospitable. The prehistoric oceans taught us that connection matters, that information exchange drives complexity, and that the most successful organisms are those that learn to listen as well as speak. The oceans have been speaking for 540 million years. Long before the first footprints appeared on land, before forests covered continents, before anything resembling modern life took form, ancient seas were already filled with conversation. Chemical plumes drifting through Cambrian currents, trilobite eyes scanning for movement patterns that meant threat or opportunity, fish coordinating through pressure waves their neighbors could feel but not see, whales sending songs across thousands of miles of open water. Every innovation, every adaptation, every sensory breakthrough was another word added to an evolving vocabulary. What we've traced here isn't just the history of how animals talk to each other. It's the story of how life solved the fundamental problem of existing in proximity to other life. Because the ocean is crowded. It always has been. And in that crowding, communication became as essential as breathing or eating. You needed to know who was near you, whether they were dangerous, whether they were potential mates, whether they'd cooperate or compete. Silence meant isolation, and isolation meant extinction. The physics of water made certain solutions inevitable. Sound would travel faster and farther than in air, so acoustic communication would flourish. Light would fade quickly with depth, so bioluminescence would appear in darker regions. Chemicals would persist and disperse, so pheromone systems would become universal. The medium shaped the message in predictable ways, and evolution discovered these solutions repeatedly, independently, across unrelated lineages. That's not coincidence. That's the ocean itself determining what works. But here's what makes this history remarkable. These weren't simple systems. Even the earliest communication networks showed sophistication we're still trying to fully understand. Trilobites with 15,000 lens compound eyes weren't just detecting light. They were processing complex visual information, distinguishing between different patterns, responding to specific signals. Fish coordinating in schools through their lateral line systems were performing real-time spatial calculations involving hundreds of neighbors simultaneously. Ancient cephalopods, potentially flashing color patterns across their skin, were operating biological display screens more advanced than most human technology until the late 20th century. The cognitive demands of communication drove brain evolution. Processing sensory information requires neural tissue. Interpreting what signals mean, distinguishing between species, recognizing individuals, predicting behavior based on context All of this demands intelligence. Marine animals weren't developing bigger brains just to think. They were developing bigger brains to communicate, and communication enabled everything else. Social structures, cooperative hunting, parental care, cultural transmission of learned behaviors. Remove communication, and marine ecosystems would collapse into collections of isolated individuals competing blindly for resources. The evolutionary arms race between signalers and receivers created escalating complexity. Better hearing drove better sound production. Better sound production drove better hearing. Better chemical detection drove more specific pheromones. More specific pheromones drove better detection. Neither side could afford to stop evolving because the other side wasn't stopping. This feedback loop, operating across millions of years, shaped sensory systems into the extraordinarily sensitive instruments we see today. Sharks detecting electrical fields at 5 nanovolts per centimeter. Whales hearing calls from thousands of miles away. Salmon navigating home using chemical signatures they remember from birth. Deception added another dimension. Not all signals were honest. Animals that could fake quality, mimic dangerous species, or exaggerate their capabilities sometimes gained advantages. This drove skepticism among receivers, which drove signal elaboration among honest signalers, which created opportunities for more sophisticated deception. The result was a constantly shifting landscape of communication strategies, where truth and lies competed for evolutionary success. There was no endpoint, no stable equilibrium, just continuous adaptation as each innovation created new opportunities and new challenges. The integration of multiple sensory modalities showed evolutionary wisdom. Species that relied on single communication channels were vulnerable to environmental changes that disrupted those channels. But species that used sound, light, chemicals, and electrical signals simultaneously had redundancy. If one channel failed, others remained functional. This flexibility allowed prehistoric marine animals to communicate effectively across vastly different habitats, from shallow tropical reefs to abyssal plains, from clear oceanic waters to murky estuaries. The same species could adjust its communication strategy based on immediate conditions, using whatever worked best in the moment. Social complexity and communication sophistication co-evolved. The most socially complex marine animals, early whales, dolphins, certain fish species, developed the most sophisticated communication systems. This wasn't accidental. Complex social structures require robust information exchange. You can't maintain long-term relationships, coordinate group activities, or negotiate hierarchies without effective signaling. And sophisticated communication enabled more complex social structures, creating a feedback loop where each drove the evolution of the other. The result was marine societies approaching the complexity of primate social groups, built entirely on communication systems that operated in a completely different sensory world. The arrival of marine mammals represented a communication revolution. When whales returned to the ocean, they brought terrestrial intelligence into an acoustic environment perfectly suited for long-distance signaling. The combination proved transformative. Within relatively brief evolutionary timeframes, they developed echolocation systems that turned sound into three-dimensional vision. They created vocal repertoires rivaling birdsongs in complexity. They established acoustic networks spanning entire ocean basins, maintained through calls that traveled the SOFAR channel like messages on an information highway evolution had discovered millions of years earlier. But this history isn't just about the past. It illuminates what we're changing now. Modern ocean soundscapes bear little resemblance to prehistoric ones. Ship noise, sonar, seismic surveys, industrial activity. These human-generated sounds exist at frequencies and intensities that never occurred naturally. Marine animals evolved communication systems optimized for specific acoustic environments. They adapted to background noise levels determined by waves, rain, geological activity. Those adaptations required millions of years. We've disrupted them in decades. The consequences cascade through ecosystems in ways we're only beginning to measure. Whales that cannot hear each other fail to coordinate migrations, breeding aggregations, feeding strategies. Fish populations experience higher predation rates because prey cannot detect predator sounds. Navigation systems fail when acoustic cues become unreliable. These aren't peripheral effects. Communication is fundamental to how marine animals survive, reproduce, and maintain social structures. Disrupting it disrupts everything. Understanding prehistoric ocean communication provides context for what we're losing. It shows us that these systems aren't simple, aren't easily replaced, and took geological timescales to evolve. The acoustic clarity that existed before human industrialization allowed communication across distances we've now made impossible. Animals that once coordinated across hundreds of miles now struggle to communicate across hundreds of meters. That represents a functional shrinking of their world, a compression of the space they can effectively use and interact within. The chemical landscape has changed too. Pollution introduces novel compounds that interfere with natural chemical signals. Agricultural runoff, industrial waste, plastic degradation products, these create chemical noise that obscures the molecular messages marine animals rely on. A fish trying to detect pheromones from potential mates might instead encounter concentrations of synthetic compounds its sensory systems never evolved to filter out. The result is confusion, miscommunication, failed coordination. But this history also suggests paths forward. If we understand how these communication systems function, we can design interventions that minimize disruption. Ship routes could avoid critical acoustic habitats during sensitive periods. Industrial activities could be scheduled around breeding seasons, when acoustic communication is most important. Technologies could be developed that reduce anthropogenic noise while maintaining human activities. None of this is simple, but it's possible if we recognize that ocean communication networks have value worth protecting. The story of prehistoric ocean communication is ultimately about information, about how life creates, transmits, and processes meaning in an environment that seems inhospitable to complex interaction, about how evolution repeatedly solved the problem of connection across vast spaces and through murky waters, about how organisms with tiny brains and alien sensory systems nonetheless managed to build sophisticated social structures, coordinate complex behaviors, and maintain relationships across time and distance. Every click, every flash, every chemical plume represented an attempt to bridge isolation, to reach across space and say, I am here, I am this kind of creature, I have these intentions, I pose this threat or offer this opportunity, and other creatures, with their own sophisticated sensory systems and neural processing capabilities, received these messages, interpreted them, and responded. The ocean became a network, not just of currents and nutrients, but of information flowing between organisms whose survival depended on understanding each other. What remains most striking is the sheer antiquity of these systems. Acoustic communication descending from a common ancestor 407 million years ago. Bioluminescence appearing during the Cambrian explosion 540 million years ago. Chemical signaling predating complex life itself. These aren't recent innovations. They're ancient, fundamental, woven into the basic architecture of marine ecosystems. Removing them or disrupting them doesn't just inconvenience a few species. It undermines structures that have existed longer than continents, longer than forests, longer than almost anything else we consider permanent features of Earth's biology. The prehistoric oceans taught life how to communicate. They provided the medium, the selective pressures, and the evolutionary time necessary for sophisticated systems to emerge and diversify. What developed there eventually spread to land when animals made that transition, carrying acoustic and chemical communication into terrestrial environments and adapting them to new physical constraints. But the ocean remains the origin point, the the place where communication first became complex, where the fundamental principles were established. Those principles still govern marine communication today. Sound travels faster and farther in water than air. Chemical signals persist and disperse through currents. Light fades rapidly with depth, making bioluminescence valuable in darkness. Electrical fields propagate effectively in conductive seawater. These physical facts haven't changed in 500 million years, and they continue to shape how marine animals interact. The sensory world of a modern whale isn't fundamentally different from that of its Eocene ancestors. The mechanisms have been refined, but the basic architecture remains. So when you consider the ocean now, remember it's not silent. It never was. Beneath the surface exists a communication network older than bones, more complex than most terrestrial systems, and more vulnerable than we initially understood. Ancient seas filled with conversations we're only beginning to decode. Modern oceans still carry those conversations, though increasingly drowned in noise we've introduced. The question isn't whether these systems matter. They've mattered for 500 million years. The question is whether we'll recognize their value before we've disrupted them beyond recovery. 400 million years of evolutionary innovation. Countless species developing countless ways to bridge the isolation of vast waters. Sensory systems of extraordinary sophistication built from simple beginnings. Neural architectures capable of processing information in real time under impossible conditions. Social structures maintained through signals that travel faster than thought. All of it still functioning, still evolving, still adapting, still speaking in languages we're only now learning to hear. The oceans have been speaking for 540 million years. The real question is whether we're finally ready to listen,